On June 2, 2012, DGP, the Center for Design and Geopolitics, held its second annual conference. Entitled Designing Geopolitics 2, it was held in the Black Box Theater of Cal IT 2, the California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology in La Jolla, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego. Okay, we're going to begin our third afternoon panel for today. Again, we've switched the order on this. We'll first hear from Jeffrey Inaba, and then from Daniel Vandervelde of Metahaven. Tim Durfee will be the in-person respondent. Molly Steenson will be the virtual respondent. So we're if doing all this on the Opta portal was a high wire act to begin with, this is high wire act with one eye closed or something like that. But it's all going to be good. Basically, thanks to the Hector and John and the excellent Cali T2 staff. Okay, so as said in the morning, our morning sessions were focused on a kind of policy as a design methodology. The afternoons, we can say the other way around. These are design practices, design projects, which we would want to read as a kind of alternative policy methodology. Let me speak a little bit about, I think, what's at stake for that, thinking about design in that way. One way to think about planetary scale computation is in terms of what in computer science we call a stack of different layers of a computer architecture, each of which is some contingently dependent and interdependent in terms of the relationships of each other. The cloud, it might be said, refers to a certain kind of foundational layer of the stack. OSMAN and Internet of Things work a little bit higher in the stack. The interfaces that we carry around in our pockets, even higher layer in the stack than that. Each layer in the stack, we could say, is a unique technology which expresses its own particular evolutionary arc and as yet an integrated component in a larger stack. Each layer is made thereby, in a sense, a different technology. Once it gets put in the stack, it becomes a different technology than the one it was before it was in the stack. And so its evolution cannot be reduced to its own intrinsic development. One layer's relation to the world at large is at least partially determined by interdependent transfers of information above and below it. Now, because every technology also contains and demands its own accident, Paul Virilio's axiom that the invention of any new technology is also simultaneously invention of a new accident, the landscape of unexpected accidents only multiplies as the layers of the stack compose and compile one another. But in this, these accidents, which another way of talking about emergent phenomena, are integral. These accidents refer not just to how a technology actually depends in some real way on the economy of solidarity that its accident guarantees, but more specifically on how every accident also creates a new technology. There is no technology without the accidental incorporation of other bodies into systems, into a domain of unforeseeable utility and coevolution. So, at the same time that we optimistically code the meta-cosmopolitanism to come, we can just as easily envision a cloud-based neo-medievalism. Visigoths with iPads. Barbarian theological microstates with thriving biotech and nanotech industries. Not unlike San Diego, perhaps. Supercomputing does not inoculate us from feudalism, from superstition and mysticism, but it can perhaps provide for a futurity and a futurism without guarantees or teleological mythology, only resiliency. Its invention depends on the deep recomputability of worldly substance. That is what resiliency means. Its invention depends on, when or where? Less than this recomputability drives a genuinely new condition to emerge some point later in time, after the revolution, next quarter, at some postponed launch event, the rebuilding of the temple. It does so instead here and in space, through the infinite recombency of an infinite asynchronic field of the longest possible now, the deep here. So, I want to then introduce our first speaker, Jeffrey Inaba, who I first met when we were teaching many years ago at SciArc in Los Angeles together in the History and Theory program there. A program I was thinking about, actually, the alumni of that History and Theory program. It's not Jeffrey, myself, but also Ed Keller, Michael Speaks, Kazis Fernales, Mike Davis, Margaret Crawford. It was not a bad program of people who have left the history of that program there. I want to begin with a discussion, something I wrote about a particular project of OMA, Office of Metropolitan Architecture, with which Jeffrey has had significant dealings as one of the founding members of AMO, the Architectural Media Organization, the non-architectural research group of the office. Today, however, different news has arrived. Beijing's new master plan for the Spratly Islands is to be designed by Rem Koolhaas and the Rotterdam-based studio Office for Metropolitan Architecture, known in Beijing for their iconic CCTV headquarters and its burned-out homunculus, the Mandarin Hotel. Local analysis of the news is fretful. The Jakarta Post writes, quote, "The Chinese occupation of the Spratly Islands was never completely unexpected, but as valid territorial claims have been made on them by so many different sovereign states, the sheer scale of planned development must be seen as well beyond its worst-case scenarios feared by Manila or Jakarta." The New Straits Times adds, quote, "The U.S. State Department loudly identified the conflict over the Spratlys as a potential trigger point for military action in the region as far back as the mid-'80s, and did so with a widely published pronouncement on the danger in 2007. When I first went to Indonesia in the mid-1990s, I learned how unambiguously the Spratlys, sort of before... I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo here as well. When I first went to Indonesia in the mid-1990s, I learned how unambiguously the Spratlys, which are sort of forlorn group of islands in the South China Sea, represented even as a symbol untethered from real geographical experience, because they're seldom, if ever, visited by civilians, a trembling fear of Chinese regional hegemony and the physical force thereof. One journalist spoke to me of that force with words that I later found out translated as volcano, sun, and earthquake. So OMA's project book on the Spratly Islands Master Plan opens with a long and precise essay on the anthropological, geologic, and military history of the Spratly Islands, followed by a comprehensive portfolio of images of other ambitious megastructures, both realized and speculative: Buckminster Fuller, Tightlands Tower, the Palace of the Soviets, Hoover Dam, Super Studio, Reiner Banham, and finally the Great Wall and Foxconn. Quote, "OMA's current proposed master plan for the archipelago chain of islands must be understood in the context of this history." So on the back page of my newspaper, I begin to draw out sketches of what the OMA project would look like based on what's described here in the project book. I wonder how different this will be from the official renders I have deliberately avoided examining. From the Jakarta Post, quote, "While Brunei will keep its dozen or so exclusive economic zones and Vietnam will retain fishing access within a 50,000 square kilometer area, China's consolidation of these satellite holdings will be essentially complete. In essence, OMA confronts the territorial spread of the Spratlys, 750 to 1,000 islands and seamounts, and instead of attempting to resolve the geographic and jurisdictional complexities of the island, they will simply merge them into an artificial mega-archipelago. The islands themselves are already spread across 3 different natural archipelagos formed by the single geologic breaking of the Pacific surface. OMA's essential insights are as follows. 1, to treat the master plan for the Spratly artificial archipelago as a regional-scale mega-network capable of intensive amputation and regrowth. 2, to treat the distributions of human program and non-human program as interchangeable packets. 3, to imbue packets with precise quantum of sovereign mobility. 4, to privilege the geometries of hyperbolic distances in all ways practical over Euclidean distances. And 5, to elevate this privilege to an ordinal principle of physical and political geography. Now, I don't know if Jeffrey worked on this project or not. It's not always clear. It's not mentioned in there, and I don't expect him to speak to this one in general. Jeffrey, one of the other things that Jeffrey and I had done more recently was for a journal that he edits out of Columbia called Volume, a very peculiar and strange interview with Vincent Gallo, which we allowed Vincent to record, edit, transcribe, and rewrite himself, which of course makes Vincent sound very interesting. Jeffrey and I sound like lunatics. But we knew that was the case going in when you do something with Vincent, so there you go. Jeffrey is also the founding director of C-Lab, a think tank at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, which studies urban and architectural issues of public consequence. The lab's ideas are broadcast through said Volume magazine, where Inaba is the features editor, and numerous publications, including the recent book World of Giving. Previously, Rem Koolhaas and Inaba co-directed the Harvard Project on the City, his research program investigating contemporary urban development worldwide. And before starting Inaba, he was principal of AMO, the research firm of Koolhaas's Office for Metropolitan Architecture. In addition to faculty member at Columbia, he's also taught at Harvard, UCLA, SCI-Arc, and did his graduate work at Harvard. So without further speculation, I'd like to introduce virtually, down here, where we can see him there and train the type thing, Jeffrey Inaba. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. I'm
Previously, Rem Koolhaas
and Inaba present at the conference, even though unfortunately I wasn't able to be there in person. So thank you, Benjamin, for the invitation. What I want to talk about today is the iteration in our work between the physical city and the extra spatial, be it the global, national, or regional. And with our projects, there's a meta feedback loop between activities that deal with urban design and activities that are representational in dealing with these extra spatial spheres. And so what I want to talk about is to outline the relationship of back and forth between cities and notions of organization at various larger scales. If our work is best known for the mapping works and graphic analyses, be it through AMO, the publications of, Volume magazine and other C-Lab works, what I want to point out is that our work isn't so much about the...
Jeffrey, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure, will you let us know exactly when you want us to switch through next slide? Just
yes.
Say next slide. Okay, so we're waiting on you for that, okay?
Okay, I'll give you the cue. And so our work is not so much about the graphics, even though we may be best known for the graphics, but that the graphics are part of a larger repertoire that we think are important in terms of the mutual support that those means of representation offer, in terms of the truth claims that we make of any given one project. Between my firm, Inaba, and my research group, C-Lab, we produce urban plans, magazines, books, soon an online publication, videos, iPad apps, as well as graphics. And so a second aspect of the presentation is to underscore the role of these tools as techniques of representation to shuttle back and forth between the physical city and the extra spatial, and that all of these are key tools of communication in both realms. Architectural or urban representation is not necessarily the central mode of expression for master plans, and diagrams are not that for the global, but rather that all of these tools together are central in terms of the way that we take information from one realm and interpose it into the other. Can you go to the first image? Should be of the Twin Towers. So we recently were asked to redesign the so-called Mosque at Ground Zero. And with this project, what was central to us was the tension between the national and the urban, in that the national paranoia post 9/11 exerted a lot of influence on what the city of New York ought to become. In particular, the paranoia of urban security and how those things would manifest in Lower Manhattan. Next slide, please. And so as part of the commission to look at the redesign of the mosque, what we first did was to look at the severe mutations to the urban form that have happened to Lower Manhattan post 9/11. You can see here that not only is it that sidewalks and streets are diverted so that pedestrians have to walk in makeshift means around buildings, but that also buildings themselves have transformed in terms of the requirements self-imposed largely of blast-proof materials that are used on the lower floors of buildings. To the extent that any notion of a pedestrian urban sphere has been reconfigured into a highly protective layer from the ground floor up to the 9th floor. If you go to the next image, please. That should be of a barrier. And so the idea then that streets have been transformed so that they're no longer continuous and that pedestrians have to make their way through a series of barricades is now simply the norm in Lower Manhattan, and that the location of security barriers are perplexing in terms of the way that they defend off space. So here it's unclear whether or not these barriers are protecting cars from crashing into Wall Street banks or making sure that a TJ Maxx is safe and open for business. Next slide, please. Even the notion of public space is something that is undergoing transformation in Lower Manhattan. As you can see here, the public plaza has been cordoned off by security fences so that tourists have to take photographs of public art in these spaces through security fences. Meanwhile, to get into banks like Chase downtown, one has to enter through a subgrade corridor to get to the banking lobby. Next slide, please. The inside of buildings, not only the outside in the urban sphere, but also the inside of buildings are reconfigured as a result of the national imposing itself on the physical city. So for example, the clear designation within lobbies between circulation zones and open spaces that might have been previously been articulated through architecture, through things like proportions of openings, scale of elements one to another, have been overridden by makeshift security walls that direct users towards things like the elevator shafts or even to the convenience stores that are located within building lobbies, segregating out commerce for the public in general and those that are allocated for workers in particular. Next slide, please. This should be an image of Deutsche Bank's lobby at 60 Wall. And it's not only that there are temporary or after the fact elements that are introduced into buildings, it's that building typologies themselves are transforming. So at 60 Wall, Deutsche Bank's headquarters, the main lobby, if you will, to enter into the bank is minuscule. It's only this size. One checks in at the counter and then goes through security barriers to the left. Whereas the traditional idea, next slide please, whereas the traditional idea of a lobby as being a large space that engages the city is then separated off to a different part of the building. And this part of the building is one that's open to the public, but it's not a space where one can enter into the rest of the building. So the idea too that lobbies are now transformed both in scale and in terms of function is something that is now commonplace within Lower Manhattan and is becoming institutionalized via things like privately owned public space. And as you probably know, this was used for a long time as the makeshift headquarters for Occupy. So next slide, please. Should be an image of Alibi, one of the publications that we do. If one idea is that there are concepts of the national imperative that impact urban form, some of the things that we do is to try to describe things at a localized level as a way to describe a much larger global condition. So with Alibi, which is a publication within a publication, it's a serial that appears infrequently in Volume magazine. We, for this particular issue, did a feature on a fictional island called Isla de San Cristobal de Grote. And with this fictional island, we described various conditions that we said were existent on the island, including phenomena that exist on isolated islands throughout the world, like the survival of endemic species, the preservation of rare habitats, the necessity to do underground farming, the pros and cons of seismic activity, and the consequences of islands deciding whether they need to simply sink or decide to swim. Next slide, please. Should be an image of one of the images from Alibi. This is the first image of endemic species. The next image deals with biodiversity. Next image, please. The next image is an explanation of underground farming on this fictional island. And then the last one, the next image shows the pros and cons of seismic activity, whether it's dealing with volcanoes or exploring geothermal energy. Next slide, please. And so through the story that we told of this fictional island, what we wanted to explain was that while all of these conditions may not occur on any one given island in the world, that there are conditions that occur throughout the world on various islands, and that islands are the test beds of, and canary in the coal mines, if you will, of transformations that are happening throughout the world today on a geopolitical as well as on a environmental level. So through these fictions, we want to spell out larger global conditions. Next slide, please. This is a feature that we did on Richard Holbrooke. Richard Holbrooke is metaphorically called an architect. He's best known, obviously, as the architect of the Dayton Peace Accords. And our argument in the feature is that he's not metaphorically an architect. He actually does what architects do. In brokering peace in the Balkans, he used architectural means as a way to negotiate between divisive parties. Next image, please. So this should be a map of the Balkans. In his negotiations, Holbrooke decided infrastructural issues, where infrastructure should go, who roads should be allocated to, the allocation of natural resources, and most importantly, the design of divisions between cities. In his book, in his biography, Holbrooke talked about the fact that borders that are very geometric, whether they're horizontal, they move from east to west, or north-south, these tend to lead to greater instability. And the longer a border can be within geographical confines, the greater potential for geopolitical stability, because it means that a person from one side of the border can more easily or might more easily tend to do business with someone on the other side of the border, or that a person on one side of the border might be ethnically related to someone on another side of the border. So in his redesign, if you will, of the Balkans, You'll see here that Holbrook made some rather large interventions in terms of remaking the borders between the various different regions, including the egg and what is called the Clark Corridor. These were not only for issues of providing borders that would allow for more logical connections between cities, but more importantly, for the extension of borders. Next image, please. I won't go into here a great deal of the various scales at which Holbrook designed, but he didn't just work on the national scale, he also worked on the architectural scale, if you will, the building scale, as well as the scale of tables. So he talks about the negotiations during the Vietnam War, and that 2 months had gone by negotiating on the geometry of the table and the dimensions of the table. And as a result of that, he thought that with the Balkans negotiations that he would simply unilaterally decide upon the table, design it himself, decide what the diameter of the table would be, which would then limit the number of people that would be involved in the central negotiations, most notably allowing him and Christopher to be at the table with all Balkan parties and along the outer perimeter allocating the Europeans. You can see from this photo that he was also very conscious of the design of the table with respect to media, here locating where the press photo op would take place. If you go to the next image, you'll see the photos as they were taken posed during the negotiations. So it's just to say that we see Holbrook as a figure who intervenes between the regional and the physical, and between the dimensional precision that's required of architecture and the media opportunities that avail themselves within dimensional constraints. And that with our work, both at C-Lab and at Inaba, it's these spheres of relation, or these scales of interaction and these modalities of communication that we are highly conscious of and try to mobilize within our work. Next image, please. This should be a graphic from the shopping book. It's one of the very first graphics I think that we became known by during the Harvard Project on the City when we did the shopping book. What's critical about this is that we felt that in working with students in architecture schools who were not necessarily trained to do writing well, that we needed to come up with our own language of trying to communicate the research that we were doing, and that graphics and quantitative analysis was a means that allowed students to work without worrying about their writing skills per se, or us having to worry about translating urban design and architectural projects to give relevance to them to deal with larger cultural phenomenon. So with this particular graphic, which shows the amount of square meters per person dedicated to shopping in different countries and in comparison to continents, what we wanted to do more broadly and as a mode of communication that permeates the book throughout is to give specific physical dimension to global relationships and to provide physical dimensions in relationship to the relative scale and import of nations, be it on the topic of shopping or some other topic otherwise. Next image, please. This is the first U.S. commission for AMO. It was a master plan for Harvard. It was we were commissioned by Harvard to explore the future expansion of the university by providing a 50-year master plan. With this diagram here, it shows the feet, it shows the rate of construction in red, so that's in square feet per hour, and then the cost of construction per square foot. And it maps that out between 1900 and 2000. You see here that the rate of construction, the speed of construction decelerates greatly down to 10 square feet per hour, whereas the cost of construction on the university campus increases greatly from the costs here are all based on $2,000. So in 1900, they were building at a cost of approximately $100 a square foot in $2,000, whereas in the year 2000, they were building at well over $1,500 a square foot. And one of the reasons why we did this quantitative analysis was to try to illustrate by showing the limitations of construction that there were cultural conditions that were going on around university development at the time. Most notably, that there was community tension and also internal university politics about where growth should occur. And it was only by means of using, revealing the quantitative consequences of these limitations that allowed the university to think out different ways in which growth ought to occur. Next slide, please. So we proposed, as part of an urban plan, translating the analyses that we did, a plan that we called the Mosque scheme. In this image here, you see the historic campus to the upper right. That's the land that Harvard owns in Cambridge. And then lower than that, you see the Charles River, which winds its way across from left to right. And then below that, Harvard's holdings in Boston, in the neighborhood of Allston. On that lower side is where a lot of the physical education, sports facilities are, as well as the Harvard Business School. Part of the community tension has to do with the fact that Harvard would like to grow, and it wants to grow in the Cambridge side to the upper right, but the town is impacted. And part of the internal politics is that none of the graduate schools want to move over to the other side of the river because they would lose the prestige of being close to the Ivy, if you will. So our proposal, next slide, was to move the river by redirecting the river to away from Cambridge so that the university would be part of one single campus, unified rather than being divided by the Charles River. And I could see on the video screen a couple of smirks. It was meant in humor in that it was intended to prompt the university to think more ambitiously about how it would attempt to resolve some inbred issues that led to the type of costly construction that was going on at the time. But nevertheless, I actually think in retrospect that it's kind of a realistic and practical plan, given the fact that in the time spent since doing this plan, that Harvard has explored a number of different options that together with the actual proposals that they've done are as much, if not more, than the cost of moving the river. Next slide, please. So this is a diagram that shows a post-design diagram, if you will, that shows that on the Cambridge side of Harvard that it's going to max out soon in terms of the amount of space that they have available to grow given its current rate of construction. And even with its land holdings in Allston, which is about the same size as its land holdings in Cambridge, that it too will run out of space very soon given the current rate of construction. Next slide, please. But with the Mosque scheme, by moving the river to the south, it provides Harvard with an additional 131 acres in the middle of its land holdings that would allow it to grow until 2130 at its current rate of growth. And I show these slides both as a verification of the project, but also as a technique to show how quantitative analysis after doing an urban design proposal are ways in which the physical can be related back to larger institutional questions. And of course, with the importance of the growth for Harvard is its ability to build better facilities to allow to attract premier professors, to allow to grow as a global institution. Next image, please. This should be an image of 3 covers of Volume magazine. The first is, to the left, is a cover of the first Architecture of Power issue that we did. That was The Power of People. The one in the middle is the Architecture of Power Part 3, or Part 2, which is The Power of Buildings. We also did a Power of Infrastructure issue. To the far right is a cover of an issue on leaks. And with the leaks issue, it was leaks leaks in as much as it was dealing with environmental leaks, informational leaks, as well as architectural leaks. So environmental things like the Exxon Valdez informational leaks like Watergate, and architectural leaks like plumbing and water and rain damage and so on and so forth. With this leaks issue, I think it's important because it was a way where the theme could overlap environmental concerns, political concerns, as well as physical concerns. And that you might see that as a thematic that permeates throughout the work that we do with Volume. And perhaps more explicitly in the power issues, there's a relationship between politics and architecture. But I think that the issues that have been actually the most successful are ones in which the themes inherently onto themselves deal with correspondences between the 3. The next image, please. And so C-Lab, as a co-editor of Volume magazine, is deeply interested in broadcasting architecture, meaning communicating the relationship between the physical, the political, political meaning power, and the informational, meaning information research that we find out. So one example of an issue that we did was on counterculture, and the idea of the issue was to rethink whether or not it's true that there's no counterculture today. The idea being that since there is no mainstream culture today, that there can't really be a counterculture that responds against the mainstream culture. But what we argue in the issue is that, in fact, the counterculture, at least the tendencies of American 1960s counterculture, is alive and well today, in the sense that community, technology, and environment, 3 key components of counterculture, and are now part of mainstream culture. That there is, in fact, a mainstream culture, and that community, technology, and environment are the 3 key elements of it. So in that sense, counterculture from the 60s is something that is central to an identified mainstream culture that we've established, or at least we've argued that we established through the issue. So the next slide is one of the images that we use to talk about community, where if community in counterculture meant collectivity, then now it's been diluted to mean consensus. Next image, please. The next image should be an image of a very young Stewart Brand. And so if technology as one aspect of counterculture was an interest in looking at the internet and the ideas of the dissemination of free information, that today we can think of it as the digital industry. Next slide, please. This should be an image of a naked young lady carrying a bunch of marijuana. She's now a land rights attorney for Native Americans in Colorado. So if environment in counterculture meant ecology, that today it means the economy of sustainability. The next image is an image of a book that we did called World of Giving. With the book, next image please, we looked at very simple things like the reasons why individuals give to one another, but also the dynamics of exchange between NGOs, nations, multinationals, in terms of giving aid from one place to another, and the information back to the giver that results from giving. Next image, please. So we were able to do things like map out and I don't know, to take credit, we never ever found a diagram that showed how $1 or €1 goes from one person to another person through the mechanics of giving. So this is a map that we tried to make that shows the ways in which governments, multinationals, bilateral agencies transfer money from one person to another. Next image, please. And this shows simply the increase of giving in monetary terms over time. Next image, please. The book also similarly tries to describe the relationship between policy and the built environment by mapping out the amount of money that's given through aid policy between hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, and the trends in terms of shifting between the two. So by hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, I mean, say in the area of healthcare, the amount of money that is decided that would go to medicine versus hospitals, the building of hospitals. Next image, please. And with the World of Giving book, we also try to describe in very particular terms how ideas of policy translate to the construction of the built environment. This, I think, is a really, really interesting idea that Otto Konigsberger worked out with the United Nations, with the idea being, that Charles Abrams worked out with the United Nations, with the idea being that building technology is for the most part very simple, except for the construction of roofs. His idea was to mobilize a policy in which money would be given for the construction of roofs in developing countries, with the idea being that there could be local assistance in terms of the construction of walls. And next image, please, should be an image of that says Free City. And so with the various kinds of work that we do, the publications like Volume, be it the issue on leaks or counterculture or the World of Giving book, what we try to do as an institution is to create connections or relationships across these themes. Conspiracies, if you will, or at least hypothetical relationships related to the global. Free City is a commissioned research project that my office is doing, looking at the advent of smarter cities, the implementation of urban operating systems, building apps, space apps, with Songdo City and Planet IT in Portugal, and the development of so-called cities in a box, where smarter cities can be developed at a relatively low cost, a low additional cost, that now cities in a box are being developed and marketed for developing economies or booming economies like China and India. And so to look at the development of smarter cities, we're taking research that we've done through previous issues like the countercultural issue and the World of Giving issue, or the World of Giving book, to hypothesize and examine this particular topic. So the mobilization of knowledge that we've created in the past is used and reconfigured in ways to be applied to either commission projects or new publications and interests that we have. Next image, please. Um, and so in understanding economic, political, environmental concerns, we translate those things often back into the urban design proposals that we make. This is a commission for Chengdu, China, a relatively small Chinese city of 10 million people, but growing very fast. What's unique about Chengdu, China is that it's one of the few regions that is very fertile and where agriculture can exist as a business and thrive as a business that would compete with industry. To the left of the image, you see landscape and mountains in green, and then in red, in black lines are the waterways that feed down into the center of Chengdu, which is bordered by a ring road that goes around its perimeter. Next image, please. Our proposal was to do what we felt was an iconic master plan, one that had a graphic impact as well as an urban impact. Here we designed a half crescent, thereby making the city asymmetrical. And also by creating a crescent around the center of the city, it limited the potential for ring roads to grow concentrically around the center. Concentric ring roads is the default urban expansion mode of Chinese cities, which we believe isn't very productive as a system insofar as it simply repeats the same problem that it causes. Ring roads are put in as a way to alleviate traffic. Once traffic gets to a higher volume, the idea is to put into another ring road, which will only increase the number, the volume of traffic, so on and so forth. And so here the idea was to limit the expansion of the city by creating a green zone around the core that would protect and allow for agricultural growth to happen to the west. And by also locating agricultural development in this area, it would protect the water sources from the mountains into the center of the city. And so this is part of a series of haiku urbanism projects that we do, where the graphic simplicity of the form is a means to communicate the benefits of the project. Next image, please. So if the 1950s in the US was an era that might be seen as one where mobility was central to the national identity, and that the cars were central to one's own identity, that a similar thing is happening now in middle-class Russia, where the increase in individual car ownership is rising rapidly. This is a commission that we did for a urban plan for 45,000 people outside of St. Petersburg. And as a way to address the need for more cars, but also to figure out a different model of planning from the Western one, here we eliminated all east-west roads. By doing so, this decreased the cost of construction for the entire project by 45% because it reduced the amount of infrastructure that needed to be inlaid into the development. So here, a loop around the development is for pedestrian and bicycle traffic to get laterally across the development. Next should be a video. If you can start that video, please. There's audio with it too. I don't know if you hear it. Next image, please. Or once it's over, next image. Hello, so are we on the next image? Ben? Yeah, okay. That the video that you saw is a video that we did that was intended to talk about aging and urbanism. With that video, the idea was to say that the elderly are not necessarily people who are checked out and uninformed about urban issues. Rather, that on the contrary, um, that the elderly might be highly informed about urban issues and invested in them. And the idea, and thus in making the video, was to rethink the subjectivity of the elderly in relationship to urban dynamics. This was part of this was done to initiate an issue on urbanism and aging for Volume magazine, which describes what we call the urban conspiracy. Next image, please. What seems interesting just experientially, empirically, is the fact that during the recession, the global recession, the urban spaces everywhere became even more beautiful over time. Next image, please. No matter where one went, whether it was in Europe, Greece, Italy, or New York, or even in California, that the quality of urban spaces accrued in terms of their beauty, in terms of the amenities that they had. Next image, please. This image should be an image of World War II Europe. And so in thinking about the improvement of urban space, most recently, we did research on aging and on urbanism and discovered a conspiracy. The conspiracy is that people who are now in their 70s have been working their whole lives to improve urban space globally. This theory, which is yet to be disproven, involves the idea that people who are 70 now of European descent were the last generation in the West to experience the complete annihilation of their cities. And as youth, they saw cities that were devastated in terms of the urban fabric and the loss of urban space. Next image, please. And there's evidence to verify this. This should be a map of 5 cities. The cities that have the oldest neighborhoods in Europe, that is, the neighborhoods with the highest concentration of people over 65, are the cities that were the most damaged during the war. Those neighborhoods were the neighborhoods that were the most bombed out, and it's as if the people who lived there were so traumatized that they couldn't leave. Next image, please. So this is an image of that we took from a textbook by a psychologist that maps out the 5 stages of grief: trauma, the moment of trauma, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Next image, please. This is an image of the frequency of the word city used in all books published in English from 1945 to 1910. So you see that in 45, there was a relatively high use of the word. It dips, it increases again in 75, dips down in 85, and then increases again towards now. Next image, please. If you overlap those 2 images, the trauma diagram and the chart of the use of the word city, you see that they overlap perfectly. And that this maps out, I think, a life course of coping with trauma. So 45 was the moment of trauma, that there's a dip, 1955, 60 denial, 1970, 75 anger, back down towards depression in 1990 and acceptance today. And it's this dealing with urban trauma that has led to their conspiracy to create public spaces. Next image, please. In walking around New York while doing this issue, we've discovered some of the leaders of this conspiracy. Next image, please. I was on the lookout for the use of urban space, finding ways in which urban space could be further improved. Next image, please. It might even be that relatives of yours are involved in this conspiracy. They may say they're going to the park to relax, but they're in fact checking it out to see if things could be improved. Next image, please. So if you take this diagram of urban trauma, it also, next image, please, fits neatly across the line of architectural and urban discourse from 1995 to the present condition. So after the moment of trauma, post-war housing and urban reconstruction as a mode of denial, reactions against modernist failures as anger, vernacular design as bargaining and depression, everyday urbanism as further depression, and globalization as a form of acceptance. Verifications, next image, please. Verification of this conspiracy can be seen in every great work of architecture. Great works of architecture are always surrounded by old people. Next image, please. Next image, please. Next image, please. Next image, please. Okay, next image should be an image of the Hollywood sign. This is the last project I'll talk about. This is a project that we did as an urban planning project. This is the Hollywood sign, national icon, if you will, at least an icon of Los Angeles. And the thing that's notable about the Hollywood sign, which was put up by a developer in the 1920s, is that the hillside here in this part of Los Angeles is no different than the hillside to the east or west. And yet, because of the Hollywood sign, the value of land properties in this area are 15% greater than towards the east and west. So it's really the presence of the sign that has accrued land property value for private owners in the area. And the fact that it stayed this way for now 8 decades on is proof that the sign is in that sense obsolete. It's done its job, it's sustained value, and to that extent is no longer needed. Next image, please. And so our proposal is to allow other neighborhoods in Los Angeles to rent out letters of the sign, and that they could be used as a way to increase the property values of those neighborhoods. Next image, please. This image should say doll. Next image, please. This should say owl. With the idea being that depending on the wealth of the neighborhood, that they could rent out as many number of letters they need to make a word, even if it only is just 3 or 2. Next image, please. And so in conclusion, next image. So in conclusion, I just want to say that if there is this back and forth in our work between urban interventions and the representation of the urban on one hand, and representations of the global and proposals that are global, that it's communication that works back and forth as a means to shuttle information between the two. If you just take magazines as one form of media, it's interesting that that they could be seen as a thing that translates urban phenomenon into a physical reality. In this case, photos of cities. Next image, please. And that as media, that more and more popular magazines are focusing their subject matter on cities themselves. So with Fast Company's rating of the top 10 cities to live in, or Good Magazine focusing on the urban environment, Wired thinking about the integration of digital technology with urban life, and The Atlantic itself creating a sister magazine called Atlantic Cities to look at cities more specifically. Next image, please. I think in the architecture profession, at least, there's always an inferiority complex that somehow we're getting to address an issue after everyone else. So if there is a convergence on cities by multinationals, by policy organizations, and by cities themselves in terms of rethinking the nature of cities, I would say that there has been a historic conceptual preparation by architects, in fact, to deal with cities through media, looking at the history of architectural publications, that it's this as a very means in which architects can begin to engage the convergence and evolution of cities, City 2.0. Next image, please. And that this could also be seen in terms of the rise of think tanks over time from the modernist era to now. Next image, please. And that if you just look in the last 10 years at the proliferation of research units in architecture, by just searching architecture and the word lab, that you'll find an infinite number of independent or academically affiliated research groups that are looking at the growth or looking specifically at the emergence of cities. And I would say that that by this, that architecture as a discipline is uniquely positioned as a discipline to think about globalization and the way in which that has a central role in the development of cities. Thank you.